Hello and welcome to our February TSCA 30 for 30 webinar. Thank you for joining us today. Good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. Good morning to those of you on the West Coast, and good evening to those of you in Europe or Asia. Today we'll be talking about Section 4 test orders that were recently issued by EPA under TSCA for high priority chemicals that are currently undergoing risk evaluations. My name is Greg Clark. I am a partner with Keller and Heckman. I work out of our Washington, DC office. I'm in the Chemical Control practice group. And I am joined today by Javane Nakumaram, who is an associate, also out of our DC office, also with our Chemical Control practice group. Today, we're going to be talking about the Section 4 test orders that I mentioned. So we'll give some background on EPA's authority to issue orders under Section 4 and identify the substances that are subject to these test orders, some rationale for EPA in terms of why they decided to do these test orders, the tests that are required, the options to respond, and the timeline. And we'll finish with some further considerations for either those who are subject to test orders now or who are involved in other high priority substances or for the future, other substances on the work plan. So now I'll turn this over to Javane, who will give us background on the rules and the orders itself.
Thanks, Greg. Good afternoon, everyone. So to begin, let's start with reviewing EPA's Section 4 testing authority. Section 4 of TSCA allows EPA to require chemical manufacturers and importers and processors to develop information on existing chemicals and submit that information to EPA. Before the Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act, EPA had the authority to require testing through the use of test rules. However, Congress was concerned that the process for issuing test rules was lengthy and that EPA had only required testing for about 200 chemicals since TSCA was enacted. So Congress amended TSCA to give EPA an additional mechanism to require testing, which is through a test order. That is the subject of what we're discussing today, EPA's use of recent test orders to require more data to evaluate certain high priority chemicals. Also, prior to TSCA reform, EPA was only authorized to require testing if certain findings were made, like that the substance may present an unreasonable risk or that the substance is or will be produced in substantial quantities. So Congress was concerned that it was difficult for EPA to make such findings without the test data to begin with. And so it provided EPA with additional testing authority. So there are more circumstances in which testing can be required under TSCA, like for pre-manufacturer notifications or PMNs under Section 5, for risk evaluations under TSCA Section 6B, to implement a requirement imposed in a rule, order, or consent agreement under 5E or 5F, or a rule under 6A, upon request of another federal agency for prioritization purposes, and to determine if export-only substances present an unreasonable risk. When EPA requires testing, it has to explain the need for the new information, how information available to EPA was used to inform its decision to ask for testing, and why an order is needed rather than going through rulemaking or a consent agreement, and a justification if the order requires the use of testing on vertebrate animals. Next slide. So here are the 9 high priority substances subject to the recent test orders from EPA. So these are 9 of the 20 high priority chemicals that EPA designated as high priority back in December 2019. So EPA is still assessing data needs for all of the high priority chemicals, and they may issue more test orders if necessary. The substances subject to test orders, they're mostly either solvents or flame retardants here. Next slide. So now we wanted to show you where these 9 substances are at in the risk evaluation process. And this graphic is from EPA's website. EPA designated these substances as high priority because they went through a screening review process where the agency evaluated a number of factors like hazard and exposure, exposure to susceptible subpopulations, and persistence and bioaccumulation, among others. So EPA determined that the substances may present an unreasonable risk because of the potential hazards and potential routes of exposure under certain conditions of use. And this is without consideration of costs or other non-risk factors. So EPA designated these substances as high priority in December 2019. EPA also has completed the final scoping documents for these chemicals in September 2020. So the scoping documents, they define the scope of the risk evaluations, and they discuss the conditions of use, the hazards, exposures, potentially exposed subpopulations that EPA plans to consider, and the risk evaluation. So the scoping is the first step in the risk evaluation. So these substances are now in the risk evaluation stage of the process, which is in the middle of the slide, where EPA is assessing whether the substances under their conditions of use prescribed in the scoping documents present unreasonable risk. So in its efforts to assess unreasonable risk, EPA, as we reviewed, has authority under TSCA Section 4 to require testing to gather more data that it feels is necessary to conduct the risk evaluation. So they're trying to satisfy some data gaps that they identified that would warrant new testing. Next slide. So EPA released the 9 test orders on January 14th, 2021, and they became effective on January 19th. So they issued these test orders for the purpose of gathering information that the agency determined was necessary to perform risk evaluations on the substances. So the test orders require certain manufacturers, importers, and processors who are named in the test orders to perform certain testing. The test order triggers obligations for these companies to respond to the test orders, which Greg will cover in more detail. The EPA, they explain in the test orders that they're issuing these under their authority to gather health and safety data and exposure information on chemicals to assess unreasonable risks. They also prescribe the specific protocols and methodologies that companies have to use to develop the data. In the statement of need, or all of the statements of need in the test orders, EPA says that in the final scoping documents for these chemicals, that was the starting point for identifying information needs. So EPA is seeking information on specific exposures where data was not addressed by the available information. They also justify, again, using a test order rather than a rule or consent agreement on the basis of the risk evaluation timeline. So EPA says that the use of its order authority will allow them to get the additional information more expeditiously than if it were to require testing through rulemaking. Next slide. So here we have a list of the different types of tests that EPA is requiring companies to conduct in the test orders. So EPA provides the name of the test and the protocol to use, and whether the testing requirement applies to manufacturers or processors or both. This table represents an aggregate of all the tests in the 9 orders, and so all of these tests listed are not required just for one substance. This is, we just wanted to put all of them into the table so you all could see the different types of studies being required. So if you're subject to a test order, it's important to look at the individual order for that substance and see which tests are required. They would be in the table 1.1 of each of the orders. And so EPA determined that as a result of data searching and screening, there was limited information on environmental hazards and occupational exposures. So that's why it's focusing on requiring different testing for these exposures. For environmental hazards, EPA identified aquatic and terrestrial organisms needed to conduct a risk evaluation, and they used conceptual models described in the final scoping documents for the high priority chemicals to identify the releases and the exposure pathways and the relevant species to be tested. For occupational exposures, EPA looked at exposure pathways necessary to evaluating risks to potentially exposed subpopulations, and their conceptual model, again, in the final scoping documents, identify worker and occupational non-user inhalation exposure and occupational dermal exposure as exposure pathways in the life cycle of the chemicals. So again, these tests are intended to address the data gaps and specific types of exposures that EPA has identified as necessary to get a complete picture for its risk evaluations. Next slide. So now Greg is going to get into the timelines and the options for responding to the test orders for the companies subject to the orders.
Thanks, Javane. So there are 5 options for responding to a test order if you received one of the test orders from EPA. And we'll go through each of these in turn. It's also good to note that because a test order includes several different tests, as Javane mentioned, it's not the entire table from the previous slide, but each of these substances has several different tests. That is the case whether you're a manufacturer or a processor. Because of the different tests, there's the ability to combine some of these options as they fit together if there is, for example, existing information for one test, but not for another. So the first option that you have for responding is to develop the requested information and perform the tests that EPA has identified. A key part of this will be negotiating a study plan with EPA. So companies that are familiar with the new chemicals program under TSCA may be familiar with testing that's been required for new chemicals, for example, under 5E consent orders. And a key part of that is often negotiating the scope or the approach for the testing that EPA is requiring. And that's the case here. For the types of tests that EPA is requiring, in particular occupational exposure, the study plan is going to be a very key point of responding to the test order, because the method selected by EPA doesn't necessarily tell you where you're going to be testing. So if your test involves inhalation exposure, potential inhalation exposure, it's going to be a key part of the response to EPA to determine and figure out where in the manufacturing or processing facility the sampling needs to occur. Which workers, which worker jobs, which tasks require sampling. And it's really going to be critical to get that dialed in right. As we'll talk about later, because this is being required as a result of the risk evaluations, it really is critical not only that it be clear what the testing, how the testing should be performed, but also that the testing is actually going to satisfy the data needs that EPA has for the risk evaluation. You wouldn't want to spend all of the time, resources, and money conducting these studies and have it not meet EPA's requirements or needs for completing the risk evaluation. If you develop the requested information, you do have the ability to get reimbursed from companies that request and receive exemptions from testing. Exemptions is that's another option that I'll discuss in a later slide. And then as part of this, you'll also indicate if you are joining a testing consortium. Consortiums are a possibility for organizing the testing to the extent that there are tests that only need to be performed once. The consortium can help organize how those tests will be conducted. And even if every company is going to be testing, for example, for occupational exposure, consortia have value in terms of ensuring that it's done in a standardized way so that the methodology, the detection limit, things of that nature are uniform across the tests so that EPA receives comparable information. The second option for responding to the test order is to submit existing information. Very critically, this information, if you're going to rely on this option, the existing information needs to be submitted with your initial response, which is due 45 days after the date, the effective date of the test order. That allows EPA to determine whether this information that is already in existence is sufficient to meet the data requirements that they have that underlie the test order. And EPA has the option to reject that existing information if it's deemed to be insufficient or not sufficiently covering the data needs for EPA. At this time, you can also indicate if you're joining a consortium. So you might form a consortium to obtain and submit existing information. For example, if you're talking about, say, an ecotox test, perhaps that's been performed under another regulatory program under REACH, and perhaps a consortium is able to obtain that study and submit it to EPA. If you select this option and EPA rejects the existing information that you have, then you have 10 days to choose another option, and then the deadlines, which we'll talk about later in the presentation, those will be pushed back by the number of days EPA took to respond. The third option is to request an exemption. EPA wants to avoid duplicative information, and that's particularly the case when you're talking about any kind of toxicity testing. But also when you're talking about occupational exposure testing, it makes sense to limit the amount of testing and resources that need to be committed. Of course, if you request an exemption, this is typically done if you have one particular company that requests an exemption, but you have another company that is in fact going to be submitting information. And that information could be on an equivalent chemical under a Section 4 rule, order, or consent agreement. So that might be a bit rare for equivalent chemicals to come into play, but a more likely scenario might be if you have several companies that are responding to a test order. One company perhaps is planning to do the testing, perhaps the other companies are smaller businesses and don't plan to do the testing themselves, but they request an exemption with the plan to reimburse the companies that do test. So that might be another option versus a consortium. The reimbursement to the companies that do the test, if you receive an exemption, that's negotiated. But if the companies cannot come to an agreement, then there is the option for the company that did do the testing to ask EPA to order the companies to pay. And there are some existing provisions that are relevant to Section 4 test rules. So they're not directly applicable here, but EPA has said that they will look to those provisions in the case that they are required to intervene if the negotiations break down. The fourth option would be to claim that you are not, in fact, subject to the test order, that you are not, in fact, a manufacturer or processor. If you choose this option, you need to support your claim by submitting some substantiating information. EPA, again, has the option to reject your claim if they're not persuaded that you are not, in fact, a manufacturer or processor. If you select this option, the deadlines don't get pushed back if EPA rejects this claim. EPA intended to exclude those processors who process substances only as an impurity. EPA used TRI information to identify processors for these test orders. So the logical conclusion here is that if you in fact reported under the as an impurity category for a substance for which you received a test order, this would potentially be an option that you could pursue to request that EPA find that you're not in fact subject to the order. The fifth option is to cease manufacture and or processing as appropriate. This has to be done within 90 days of the effective date of the order, and this would allow you to avoid having to do the testing. You would need to submit a certification from an authorized representative of the company. So obviously this has along with it the obligation not to submit any false or misleading information to the agency. There is a possibility to resume manufacturer processing in the future, but again, that's going to be bound up with the idea that you can't have, that shouldn't be any company's plan to cease manufacture in a way to avoid temporarily the requirement to respond. And indeed, if you do ever resume, you would require a new response to the test order. Likely, at that stage, you might request an exemption, and then you'd have an obligation to pay those companies that did test. So an approximate timeline for responses, as I mentioned, the initial response is due within 45 days of the effective date of the order. So that's March 5th. And in that initial response, you need to select one of those 5 options that we just went through. And you also need to indicate if you're joining a consortium. If there is a consortium that's going to be formed, the general understanding of how that would occur is that each company would respond, identify themselves as generating the information, selecting that option 1, most likely, and indicate that they're forming a consortium. And then the consortium would also submit an initial response in order to identify the consortium to EPA so that you can get into negotiations with EPA in terms of the initial study plans. Now, there are fees that apply under test orders. The fee is low, however, it's $9,800, and that's spread across all of the parties. There is, of course, an opportunity under the fee regulations to set up a fees consortium to split those fees. If there's no fees consortium, and a fees consortium and a testing consortium can be different. If there is no fees consortium, EPA will split that on an even basis evenly per company. I mentioned the initial study plans. Those are due 75 days after the order became effective. The fees are due 120 days after the effective date of the order. The final study plan has to be submitted 60 days after you submit that initial study plan. And in between those 2 markers, you'll have negotiations with EPA on those points that we mentioned before. And then the final study reports for each of the tests that's required are generally due 8, 9, 12, or 13 months after the effective date of the order. The occupational exposure testing is generally due 8, 9, or 12 months, and that depends kind of on the nature of the test. The more complicated tests they're given more time. Don't think of this as tiered testing because all of the tests need to be conducted. There's no tiered decision making here. And then the ecotox testing, I think, is due generally 8 or 13 months after the effective date of the order, depending on, again, on the nature of the test. So what is the use of this information? What's going to happen after all of this information is submitted? Well, as Giovanni noted, the risk evaluations here are ongoing. And this is intended to fill data gaps that were identified during earlier stages of the risk evaluation. So as we talked about with the study plans, it's really critical that the information that is developed meets the needs of EPA to fill those data gaps. So when you're talking about exposure testing, occupational exposure needs to target the tasks and jobs that EPA is going to be assessing. I think there probably needs to be not just a consideration of workers, but also occupational non-users. I think that's something that we saw on some of the risk evaluations that were completed for the first 10 chemical substances, for example, asbestos, in terms of there was information on certain tasks and certain jobs, as well as certain area monitoring information that EPA then attributed to occupational non-users. And there were rightful complaints about whether that's actually appropriate to assume that occupational non-users are exposed to area monitoring data. So ensure that the data gaps are being appropriately addressed by the testing that's being conducted. And that also applies when you're thinking of ecotox testing, making sure that the appropriate range finding is done, ensuring that the test concentrations are appropriate to the consideration of the likely exposure and releases to the environment. As we've seen in other risk evaluations, both under Section 6 and for new chemical substances, EPA is likely to use the highest exposures and the most sensitive organisms in terms of its evaluation and determining whether there's an unreasonable risk. The final risk evaluations for these 9 substances are ongoing, and those are due December of 2022, 3 years after these substances were designated high priority. EPA does have the option to extend for 6 months. So that would potentially take us out to June 2023. But if you think back to the timeline for these final reports, which are up to 12 or 13 months after the effective date of the order, so that would be January of 2022. Obviously, this information is going to be continue to come in while EPA is working on these risk evaluations. If the final risk evaluation is due December of 2022, then we would expect that the draft risk evaluations, EPA would at least have a year in advance in order to get comments on those drafts and address those comments, and also address any other outstanding issues that they raise. So it's going to be a very tight timing for integrating this information into the risk evaluation. So keep that in mind. Big news in the last couple days is that there was a review by the National Academy of Sciences of the TSCA systematic data review that's been used in the risk evaluations conducted so far. EPA's approach was heavily faulted by the academies, and EPA has said that they are going to move away from the approach that was used for the risk evaluations to date. So it's unclear what impact that will have. Certainly some of the issues that were raised relate to assessing different information, the quality of different information. We'd expect that this information, because it's being generated under a test order, it's the most fresh, and EPA will be negotiating the terms and the plan for the testing, that this information should be given highest degree of relevance by EPA in terms of the risk evaluation. But this is something to keep in mind as EPA reworks its systematic data review on the fly. So what are some other considerations for the future? Giovanni noted that EPA decided to use test orders because it felt that if it used the test order, it could generate this information faster than if it did a test rule or negotiate a consent agreement. And that's certainly true based on the timeline that we just talked about. For other substances that are either undergoing risk evaluations now or that will be included in the next batch after these are completed, it just emphasized the importance of either submitting existing data early so that EPA doesn't have a data gap. And certainly some of the substances, certain of the 20 high priority substances, received good information from industry as part of the scoping process for the risk evaluations. Whereas for some other substances, very little information was submitted, very few comments received. So this really does emphasize the importance of submitting existing data early or negotiating with EPA for when that information will go in to avoid the need for a test order. It's also important to negotiate the use of data submitted for other regulatory regimes. So for example, information that was developed under REACH. So to the extent that there's an endpoint that's relevant to the EPA's evaluation of a substance, but that information was submitted under REACH, while there are certainly data rights issues that come into play, we see here that EPA is going to require testing for key endpoints that are not represented in available information, and if it's not submitted, even though it is perhaps been generated under REACH or another program. And of course, another option is to identify an acceptable chemical analog for any existing data. That might, again, avoid the need for a test order. So that is the end of our presentation. I see that we have a couple comments here, or questions that I'll just try to answer very quick as we're at the end of our time. I'll note that manufacturers under the test orders also includes importers. Importers are considered to be manufacturers, whereas processors are those companies who purchase the substance domestically and process it in the US. So our next TSCA 30 for 30 will be in March 17th, and that'll also be the date of our next REACH 30 for 30. And we also have an upcoming OSHA 30 for 30. So please take advantage of our webinars, and we look forward to seeing you again next month. Thanks again for joining us.